Hello, everyone, and welcome to Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. We have a little special show today, Investigative Genetic Genealogy, a game changer. And even in the cases that we have been following so far, we have seen in the technology, investigative genetic genealogy, and we are also seeing DNA coming into almost every, now I shouldn't say every case, but many of the cases that we feature on this show, DNA becomes one of the most important pieces of evidence we've had. And we see it in the Brian Kohberger case just very recently. The Kohberger defense motions denied. And that really had a lot to do with the testing of the DNA and the attorney for Brian Kohberger insisting that new searches in a DNA or new tests were a brand new search. And the judge totally disagreed and denied all the motions that were presented. But what we really want to focus upon is what is investigative genetic genealogy and how has it changed? I'm not going to call this a game because it's not a game, but how has it changed criminal investigation? And how has it made it so much more difficult for would-be serial killers, serial rapists to ply their trade and to get away with what we would call a serial killer? We would call a pattern. On the NYPD, a pattern was 2 or more. So are we going to get so good at apprehending criminals and identifying them that patterns won't exist anymore? That is the goal. That is the goal. Serial killers, serial rapists with the technology. And what we're talking about, of course, is investigative genetic genealogy. So folks, hold on to your hats. Hold on to your drink. Hold on to your loved ones. Hold on to your service animal. We're about to enter true crime from a police perspective. We're about to enter the off-the-cuff zone. The police off-the-cuff zone.
There has to be some common sense.
They were the ones who called 911 to get him help, and now they're calling for change.
And now a word from our sponsor. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC, BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. So probably the most famous case that was solved by investigative genetic genealogy is what you see on the screen right now, the Golden State Killer. And what a horrific man, a horrific case. 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and countless burglaries. And it took nearly 50 years to catch this diabolical savage that operated. And he would have lived his life. He would have went through his life without ever getting caught. But this technology advance caught this man and brought some type of closure to his victims. What is investigative genetic genealogy? Investigative genetic genealogy is a technique that uses DNA analysis and genealogy to help solve crimes. It is used to identify suspects and remains in violent crimes, such as murder and sexual assault. Investigative genetic genealogy can also help exonerate the wrongly convicted. And how it works. A DNA profile is uploaded to a genetic genealogy database. The database matches the profile to other profiles to determine likely relationships. Family trees are built using public records to narrow down the likely identity of the individual. The identified individual is compared to the DNA sample from the crime scene to confirm a match. Uses of IgG, identifying suspects in violent crimes, identifying unknown remains, exonerating the wrongly convicted, and solving cold cases. What are the limitations? Investigative genetic genealogy is only an investigative lead, and all leads must be confirmed or refuted with a direct DNA comparison. Forensic genetic genealogy, a type of investigative genetic genealogy that uses more advanced DNA analysis techniques. And they use the consumer DNA sites such as Ancestry.com, 23andMe, GEDmatch, Family Tree. So what are some of the things that we have to be aware of in using some of these databases? Well, some of the things that we have to be aware of is that they're not open to anyone. Some of them, if used by law enforcement, they must obtain a search warrant, an order, or a court order to use their database. So it's not open to everyone. Investigative genetic genealogy, therefore, uses what we know as a family tree. And they build this family tree and then they eliminate people till they can get to a suspect or a person that may have committed the horrific crime in which is being investigated. We've seen this not just in identifying criminals, but in identifying victims. Much of the Gilgo Beach case, much of the victims were identified using this technology, investigative genetic genealogy. Unbelievable how the techniques used in this case identified people who had been dead for 30 or 40 years. And that this technology is something that is getting better every single day. Let me put this on the screen. This is from Law and Crime.
Prior. But recently, officials in Suffolk County on Long Island sent DNA from the remains to Othram Labs in Texas. Othram works with law enforcement officials to identify remains and help solve cold cases. Othram used genetic genealogy to identify Karen Vergata. Suffolk County officials haven't said whether they believe Vergata's murder is connected to the Gilgo Four. Rex Huerman is a 55-year-old architect from Massapequa Park. He faces charges in the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four. He's pleaded not guilty to the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Costello, and Megan Waterman. The DA says he is the prime suspect in the murders of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Huerman insists through his attorney that he didn't do this and that he's innocent. Joining me to discuss the technology used to identify.
Well, this now is it's a little bit dated because we know that the Karen Vergata case has been connected to Rex Huerman. And Rex Huerman now, based on investigative genetic genealogy, has been charged with seven cases now. 7 of the bodies recovered in the Gilgo Beach area have now been connected to Rex Huerman. So when we talk about investigative genetic genealogy, it is the advancement of it is just incredible. In just a few short years, investigative genetic genealogy has revolutionized the field of cold case investigation. Cases that were considered cold are now being relooked at. Families of missing persons may finally have answers to what happened to their loved ones. The process of IgG utilizes public direct-to-consumer databases and the same genetic genealogy techniques that have historically been used to help adoptees identify their birth families or parents. IgG involves determining relationships between individuals based on their shared DNA. When combined with traditional genealogical research, Potential identifications of unknown individuals can be made to help in unidentified human remains cases or to develop leads in unsolved violent crimes. And of course, we see the Golden State Killer suspect was identified using an ancestry site. Historically, forensic unknowns are analyzed using STR markers or short tandem repeats. And if the suspect is known, the DNA profile can be uploaded to the FBI's combined DNA index system known as CODIS. The CODIS database allows for the comparison of forensic unknown samples between cases and also to DNA profiles of known offenders who have been required to provide samples of their DNA. A limitation of CODIS is that there are many instances where there is no link or hit developed between a question sample and the known offender database. So the CODIS database is simply unidentified forensic DNA that came from crime scenes. The other is convicted offender DNA taken from offenders who have been arrested and convicted. And that is what is contained in the FBI database known as CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. So it has its limitations. But these commercial sites that we see are the ones that this new science is unbelievable in what it can capture. And also in regards to identifying the remains of bodies that we don't know about or missing persons. So all of those things are what we are using currently, investigative genetic genealogy too. This is the Suffolk County District Attorney, Ray Tierney.
Who was 34 years old.
For 27 years, Karen Vergata was known as Jane Doe number 7 or Fire Island Jane Doe. We talk with one of the scientists who helped identify her once and for all. Welcome to Sidebar here on Law and Crime. I'm Anjanette Levy. No one knew Karen Vergata's name, only that part of her skull had been found on Gilgo Beach, her legs found on Fire Island years prior. But recently, officials in Suffolk County on Long Island sent DNA from the remains to Othram Labs in Texas. Othram works with law enforcement officials to identify remains and help solve cold cases. Othram used genetic genealogy to identify Karen Vergata. Suffolk County officials haven't said whether they believe Vergata's murder is connected to the Gilgo Four.
Well, we know now that it is. Okay, so we know that the Karen Vergata case has been identified and has been connected to Rex Schuerman, who is known now as the alleged Gilgo Beach killer, the alleged Gilgo Beach murderer. And these cases that for years were unidentified females that were found within the killing fields known as the Gilgo Beach area, that is now a known factor. There are still numerous bodies that are part of the Gilgo Beach investigation that have not yet been identified. And when we talk about investigative genetic genealogy, there is no one better, no one more knowledgeable probably than the dean of investigative genetic genealogy across the country. And her name is C.C. Moore. She's a DNA expert who has solved over 200 plus criminal cases through this science, through investigative genetic genealogy. She appeared on CNN a couple of years ago in regards to the Idaho 4 case, the 4 college students who were slaughtered in their off-campus house by a defendant who now has been arrested. His name is Brian Koberger. He's awaiting trial. And DNA, of course, has come into play in this case in regards to touch DNA that was found on a knife sheath that was found on the bed with one of the victims that was left behind by the killer. That DNA that was identified from the button of the knife sheath belongs to the defendant, Brian Koberger. And just recently, the judge in the case, Judge Stephen Hippler, he ruled that he would allow all of the evidence collected by the prosecution to be used in this trial against Brian Koberger. So all of the motions that were filed by the defense were denied by this Judge Hippler. This is C.C. Moore in an appearance on CNN talking about the science of investigative genetic genealogy. I want to play a bit of this.
Is that anyone who perpetrates this type of crime in the future should be aware that they will be identified. They will be caught. There really is no reason that we should see serial killers, serial rapists moving forward. This guy, potentially could have become a Ted Bundy or even a Zodiac, not identified 50 years later. But because of the DNA technology, the advances that we're seeing, both in investigative genetic genealogy and the ability to use tiny amounts of DNA, we can identify someone, whether they are in the law enforcement database or not.
Cece, the cases that you have cracked, for which you have become famous, are the cases that necessitate you putting together, in connection with a private lab, a very complicated family history, family tree, and tracing back cousins and generations. That doesn't seem to be what took place here.
Well, I don't think we can reach that conclusion yet. Investigative genetic genealogy is simply a tip. It's a lead generator. It should never be used as evidence against a suspect. And so it is proper that it would have been left out of the affidavit, in my opinion, because it should not form the basis of an arrest warrant. And so even though they didn't put it in there, I don't think we can rule it out. We don't know whether it was what initially identified him as a person of interest, and then they looked more closely at that tip about the car, or it could have gone the other way, where they identified him through that tip about the car, and at the same time they were working on the genetic genealogy and may have built his family tree to see if it was consistent with what they were seeing. I have done that in some cases. If there are persons of interest, you can very quickly rule them out or potentially not be able to exclude them, which is what would have happened in this case.
Very, very interesting, because one of the things, or one of the many things that we're facing, that law enforcement is facing, of course, is the legal ramifications of investigative genetic genealogy. There is basically no case law on this. I shouldn't say none, but very little case law on this. So in the case of Brian Koberger, as you could see on this thumbnail, his defense chose to challenge the DNA, to challenge the evidence, because based on the DNA and the DNA identification, the touch DNA on the knife sheath came back to Brian Koberger. All the evidence that came after that, based on that identification, would become what we know in law enforcement as fruits of the poisonous tree. So if the Judge Hippler, in the case of Brian Koberger, threw out the DNA identification, threw out the DNA that was on the button of the knife sheath, then all evidence coming after that would be known as the fruits of the poisonous tree. And that evidence would all be suppressed. So everyone from the prosecution in regards to the 4 students that were murdered in the Idaho 4 case are all just thankful that the judge in the case ruled in favor of the prosecution, because without that evidence, there would be no case against Brian Koberger, or the case would be 100% circumstantial. So those are the questions we have here. This is from CBC, cracking cold cases using investigative genetic genealogy.
When you upload your information into GEDmatch, do you realize that you're uploading your sisters, your parents, your potential grandchildren's genetic information into this system? Then you can also explore phenotyping, which is looking at the hair color, the eye color, the skin pigmentation of an individual, and ancestry informative markers, which are allowing you to gain information about where a person might have come from. So if an individual has a particular allele or single nucleotide polymorphism at one particular location in the DNA, it could mean that they likely originate from one particular part of the world because that variation or that polymorphism is only seen in that part of the world. In the context of cold cases, missing persons, and unidentified human remains, phenotyping and ancestry become extremely powerful. There was a case on the west coast of Canada involving a young girl who was murdered, Marissa Shen, and they didn't really have any investigative leads or information about the suspect from the DNA profiles that they generated. So they then took that DNA and performed phenotyping and ancestry testing in order to gain inferences about the suspect. So they were then able to build a composite profile about where that suspect likely came from and what that suspect potentially could have looked like in order to take the investigation in a new direction. GEDmatch is a free public database. And how GEDmatch works is individuals who participate in programs like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, etc., download their individual profiles from the paid programs that they participated in, and then upload independently their profiles into GEDmatch. The more you are related to somebody, the more similar your DNA will be. And so GEDmatch takes all of that genetic data that you've put into the system and then starts matching it and giving you a number as to how much of your chromosomal DNA matches somebody else. So how investigators are able to really take advantage of this new genetic genealogy era, they essentially just mimic how these companies have designed their DNA kits. And so they take the crime scene evidence and they run it through this new DNA kit that gives a DNA profile or a genetic output that is very similar to these big companies. And from there, they can upload it into the public database in order to see if there are any potential relatives or any potential matches.
Unbelievable. It's the technology. And as CeCe Moore said earlier on, there will be a day where we will not see serial killers anymore, where we will not see serial rapists, because the technology will be there to catch them so early on the investigation. Like you see this savage here on the screen, right? The Golden State Killer. Just incredible what technology will do for us. Investigative genetic genealogy is a powerful tool. However, there's a clear need for guidelines, regulations, and oversight of investigative genetic genealogy practices and practitioners. Few states have established laws governing the use of investigative genetic genealogy in criminal cases. There are additional privacy issues related to direct-to-consumer users and their informed decisions to opt in or out of law enforcement use of their genetic information. This webinar will present an overview of the IGG, what I'm reading to you right now, process and how it differs from current forensic laboratory processes and CODIS. We discussed CODIS earlier. This is coming from the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. So one of the problems, of course, that we have with investigative genetic genealogy is having law and law enforcement and the fair trial for the accused, for it to have the proper guidelines. So law enforcement is not acting outside these guidelines. And those are the things and the issues that we must talk about, that we must know about. But without guidance, for example, of case law, how is law enforcement supposed to act and how are they supposed to perform their duties. In regards to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, it's run by the FBI. And it's believed that in the future, and not just the future is here now, investigative genetic genealogy will also be performed by the FBI. So one of the most important scientific investigative tests will be performed by the FBI, but also by private labs such as Othram, which is one of the leading labs in the country in regards to these tests. And they were used in the Brian Koberger case in the students from the Idaho 4. Let me pull this up from Law and Crime.
DNA testing. Of course, you have to have a DNA profile to do what you do. But you guys use a different type of profile to do the investigative genetic genealogy. It's called a SNP, if I am saying that right. So tell us how you really start at the beginning and go about building these family trees and everything like that off of a DNA profile, an STR profile that you later, I guess, I don't know, develop another type of profile for.
Absolutely. So standard forensic testing that's been used for 30 years, DNA testing that has gone to court all this time, is known as STR testing. There you're looking at 20 STR markers and you're comparing them to the known database of perpetrators that is owned by the FBI, CODIS. So sometimes you guys may have heard that as CODIS testing. If someone is in the known perpetrator database, then you have a direct hit. But your DNA would have to be in there, or maybe the DNA of your child, like a direct familiar relationship. What we do is we build profiles that have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of markers, up to 1 million markers. So these profiles have all of these SNP markers that you just discussed. And when you upload those to genealogical databases consented for law enforcement use, you're able to get really distant relationships. The more markers you have, the more distant relationships you can actually reach. And so you can get a sixth cousin, a fifth cousin, a fourth cousin, and all of us are related to some degree. Most areas in the United States, they were founded from a few key families. And so to some degree, there'll be some relative in there. And they're not the relatives that come home for Thanksgiving with you, not the relatives that you know or you would call, but there would be some match in these databases.
Unbelievable, right? So that is just a little sample of what Othram Labs is doing and Christine Middleman, and they've done some amazing forensic work involving investigative genetic genealogy. So that's just a little tip of the iceberg here. And we spoke about investigative genetic genealogy, a game changer, 100% absolute game changer. Folks, if you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button on the screen. If you want to contribute to us, we have a Patreon with 4 different levels, and you can join us by joining our YouTube channel memberships. I'm Bill Cannon from Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. Have a great day, everyone. See you next time.
One episode just ain't enough.